30th of June 1933 at midnight, PC Irving from Hebden Bridge police station was doing his rounds of the town, and he came here to what is now Station Road, and he could see a woman seemingly soaked through staggering about in this area here. He shone his light into her face, and he could see that she was absolutely dripping wet. She said, "I've tried to commit suicide, but I can't do it. I've jumped in the canal and it didn't work. And I've killed my husband." The woman's name was Elizabeth Agnes Rhodes, a 41-year-old woman from Ireland who lived with her husband at a farm called Snow Booth up on the hills at Old Town above Hebden Bridge. She kept saying, "I know I've killed him, I hit him with a hammer." Just in case, PC Irving immediately charged her with potential murder. And when she was at the police station, Irving could tell that there was this strong smell of smoke in the room, which he presumed was coming from her clothing. The police officer took the key of Snow Booth from Elizabeth and sent some officers up to the house to see what they could find. Nothing could have prepared them for the grisly scene that awaited them when they arrived. So on the hillside above is what was called Snow Booth Farm. It's kind of lost in the fog a bit today. It's now called Snay Booth, so I guess the current owners kind of want to remove its name from its grim past. And as it's now lived in and private, we won't go any further than this today. Instead, we're going to head across the hillside to a more dramatic location. So the police arrived at Snow Booth Farm, and they entered using the key to the ground floor. First thing they noticed as they arrived was a large patch of blood on the ceiling, and it had been dripping through. So you've heard of the film from the 70s, The House That Dripped Blood. This was it. What they then decided to do was to head up the stairs. So they went up, but the top floor was full of smoke. So they decided on a different idea. Police got a ladder, and they climbed up the ladder to look through the window of the bedroom. It was still full of smoke, but they could see that there was a bed in the room on fire. So they called for the fire brigade, and they arrived, and when they put the fire out, what they discovered was certainly a scene directly from a horror film. It was the burnt, charred body of Samuel Redmayne Rhodes, Elizabeth's husband. So the body of Samuel was completely burnt to a cinder. The mattress was pretty much burnt through and gone. And so charred was his body that any attempt to move him, bits of him fell off, like his hand and his foot. They were so badly gone. But he was found with his arms crossed across his chest. But what they also realised, that he'd suffered a catastrophic head injury, possibly from the hammer blow that Elizabeth had landed. His jaw had been completely severed from his skull, and later examination they even found that bits of tooth and bone were in his stomach. But what wasn't in his lungs was smoke, which kind of suggested that Samuel was dead long before the fire was lit. The police decided to conduct a search of the property to see what else they could find. They found some very interesting items. In the burnt out room itself, they found a blooded sledgehammer, and they could also tell that there were blood stains splattered on the walls, each wall of the room. In an adjacent bedroom, they found a bed that was strangely covered in sick. There was also, on a cabinet, a little bottle with some liquid in, which found out was an attempt at poisoning. They also found a razor blade, which was covered in blood. These are all things that Elizabeth had tried to take her own life after killing her husband, it seemed. She tried to slit her throat with the razor. It didn't work. She tried to drink the poison, but she'd just thrown it up. She tried to be in the room where the fire was, but instead had just choked and left the room. So that last attempt was to head down to the canal in Hebden and throw herself in. But she floated and couldn't drown. These all made for a sensational story. And of course, what followed after this murder was sensational headlines. Elizabeth claimed that all through their married life, Samuel had abused her. He'd beaten her up, pulled her hair in public and choked her, and even thrown stones at her, and quite often said that he would kill her. And this was something that had happened because even neighbours and people in the locality had seen it and backed her up on that story. At some point, Samuel even started bringing home another woman, which all got a bit too much for poor Elizabeth. 7 o'clock on the night of the murder, Samuel had returned home, and he'd gone into the house, and Elizabeth had been listening to the radio. He'd switched it off and said that he was going to do her in. So Elizabeth had taken that action first and attacked Samuel in bed with the hammer. She never denied it, and she was remorseful throughout the trial that took place at Leeds just a year later. And as I mentioned earlier, there were these sensational headlines. I look at even this for the front of a newspaper that appeared in 1933.
It's not the night for sweet revenge. It's not the night.
So you can imagine what those headlines were like, can't you? They focused on three particular things. One, the location of the house on the wild and windy moorlands, a bit like Wuthering Heights in a way. Secondly, the brutality of Samuel's death, specifically picking up on the charred remains on the bed. And thirdly, the rather bizarre attempts by Elizabeth to take her own life, almost like a comical story that didn't pan out the way she planned. But because she never pleaded anything other than guilty, things didn't quite go as she might have thought, because what they said, although they were planning to focus on self-defense being the reason of Samuel's death, the fact that the bloodstains on the ceiling were in a different area to where the body was found suggested that Elizabeth had carried out that hammer attack on her husband in a different room altogether, because those bloodstains were not the same place. Samuel must have been dead before he ended up on that bed, which she claimed is where she'd hit him originally. With the self-defence plea now out of the window, the jury went away to deliberate on what had transpired over the hearing. And in just 9 hours' time, they brought back the sentence of guilty. The judge put on his black hat and found Elizabeth guilty of murder and sentenced her to death. Now this was 1933, and at that point there'd been no other woman sentenced to death for about 10 years. And even prior to that, women sentenced to death was a very rare occasion. Quite often they were let off on appeal. The headlines again then struck out, because what happened is the public were quite angry at what sentence had happened, and there was also a lot of apathy towards the death sentence still being a thing in 1933, to the point that really they were against it, the public were against it. And they also took pity on Elizabeth for the abuse that she'd suffered at the hands of her then husband. So a petition was started, firstly by a reverend in the area, which hit Hebden Bridge and eventually nationwide. And the petition reached thousands and thousands of signatories, all wanting to see a different outcome for Elizabeth. And a week before she was due to be executed in 1935, she found that she was released from prison just over 2 years after being sentenced to death. So that's quite a big difference in time from what was expected. Maybe she could have even been put in prison for life, but no, she was released. After being released, she went back to Ireland, where she was born, and never heard from again. And the story has passed down through generations and changed over time to things that had happened at Snow Booth. There is even talk, a folklore talk, that there was a man used to just play his piano when he was snowed in, and his wife got so angry that she killed him and chopped his head off, and you can still hear the piano. No, none of that happened. We go back 90 years in time to the events of Snow Booth. But was it the right call? What do you think? Do you think Elizabeth should have been released from prison for murder, even with what happened? I'd love to know what you think. Okay. So it's been a bit of a grisly story, this one. So if you are still watching, well done. And I hope you like the location we've found to cover our story on the house that dripped blood, the murder at Snow Booth. Okay, see you soon.